Aloha and konnichiwa. I'm Reina Kaneko, President of the Japan America Society of Hawaii, and welcome to our Japan Currents program, where we cover current topics related to the U.S.-Japan relationship. What we will explore today are the political and economic challenges facing the U.S. and Japan, particularly in light of what is happening in the Ukraine. Before we begin, I want to welcome our in-person audience as well as our online audience. Thank you so much for joining us today. I would also like to thank and recognize the Embassy of Japan and the National Association of Japan America Societies for their sponsorship of this event. At this time, I would like to introduce Mr. Peter Kelley, President of JASH, to say a few words of welcome. Peter?
Thank you, Reina. I'm Peter Kelley of the National Association of Japan America Societies. Welcome to the in-person audience and the online audience. I think all of us who are not in Hawaii wish we were in Hawaii. I want to remind you all that there are 38 Japan America Societies all around the United States. And like the Japan America Society of Hawaii, each one of them is a locally funded, locally managed, not-for-profit organization devoted to deepening the relationship between Americans and Japanese at the local level. It's the strongest, the Japan America Society network is the strongest private network that supports any bilateral U.S. relationship, and we're pleased to be part of it. The National Association of Japan America Societies, where I work, our job is located in Washington, D.C. Our job is to provide Japan-related programs to our member societies. We have a series involving public affairs, geostrategy, security, culture, and 2 business series. All of them are funded by different funders whose missions align with those program series. The Japan America Society of Hawaii has been a very successful applicant for JASH programs and has hosted all of those different program series over the years. So congratulations to Reina and her and the staff of the Japan America Society of Hawaii. Tonight's program is part of our public affairs series. It's called Japan Currents. There are 10 Japan Currents programs happening at different Japan America societies all over the United States in the first 3 months of this year. Each of them has a topic chosen by the local society to be which is of specific interest in the local area, but relates to the U.S.-Japan relationship. The funder for this program, our funder, is the Embassy of Japan in Washington, D.C., and we are very grateful for their support. We're also grateful to the speakers. These programs are all about the speakers, and we have 2 wonderful speakers tonight who will be discussing the current state of the U.S.-Japan relationship in what has turned out to be quite a turbulent world. We are looking forward to Dr. Nakabayashi and Dr. Walker, who will join us in a few minutes. And again, thank you to all of you for joining, and thank you to the staff of the Japan America Society of Hawaii for hosting this program, partly online, which is a nice development in this at this point, to at least go partly online. Reina?
Thank you, Peter. Our guest speakers today are Dr. Joshua Walker, President and CEO of Japan Society. Joshua is joining us from New York City tonight. And joining us from Tokyo is Dr. Mieko Nakabayashi.
What is JASH? JASH to us is about...
Professor at the School of Social Sciences at Waseda University. Welcome to our distinguished speakers. Our moderator for today is Ms. Barbara Tanabe, owner of Hoʻakea Communications and current director and past chair of JASH. So I'd like to welcome Barbara up, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Reina, and thank you, Peter Kelley. And welcome to Dr. Walker and Professor Nakabayashi. This is going to be a really interesting hour. What I'd like to do is kind of go over the program format with you. We will have the 2 speakers do very short presentations of their perspective of the current event that involves Japan, the United States, and of course the rest of the world. And then what I'd like to do is ask them to engage in a conversation and respond to your questions. For those of you online, we ask that you use the chat box, and Raina and the staff will be monitoring those chat questions. And since we cannot see it here, Raina or someone on the staff will ask the questions orally, and then we will ask our two speakers to respond. We will also ask the audience, if you have questions, please raise your hand, and Lila will be with you with a microphone. So please be prepared. We earlier had discussed the current state of global affairs with Dr. Walker and Professor Nakabayashi, and we decided that because the Ukraine war is really roiling everything, economics, politically, socially, that we really need to talk about what's happening in the Ukraine situation from the perspective of both Japan and the United States, and how we feel what's happening there, a wartime situation, and the sanctions, how those will affect all of us here in the Pacific region. So I'm very pleased to first welcome Dr. Walker with his perspective. Joshua, please take it away.
Thank you so much. Everybody can hear me, right? Just want to make sure. All right. It's 2022, but every year is like 2020 when you're online. I really wish that I was there in Hawaii. It's great to see so many friendly faces, both there in person and Raina's leadership. She recently joined the executive committee of the National Association of Japan America Society that Peter referenced, and to see my good friend, Professor Nakabayashi in Tokyo. We were discussing right before this that you couldn't have picked a more timely day for this. There was literally an earthquake just in Japan, and we're glad to see that there's no loss of life as of yet, but it's a powerful reminder of just how fragile the world is, both in terms of natural disasters, but also human disasters. I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that today, the president of Ukraine gave a major address in Congress where Hawaii was well represented once again. He referenced the concept of Pearl Harbor and what it was like to be under attack. And so I think in many ways, the conversation we're having today is exactly in the right place. I'm bringing a very East Coast perspective. I'll tell you right up front that that's the perspective I'm bringing from here in New York, but also as someone who spent time in government and brings a DC policy perspective. And then we've got Professor Nakabayashi, who has a long experience both in the political side on the policy angle and now in the academic world from Tokyo. So our meeting spot is here in Hawaii, and I couldn't think of a better time for it. As Barbara referenced, if I just went right into US-Japan relations and talked about what's been going on with the Biden administration and Kishida administration, it would seem a little tone deaf, given that we're literally on the precipice of not just a regional war, but a world war. I think when you think about it, it sounds hyperbole for me to say that, but what Russia did a little bit less than a month ago in terms of invading Ukraine has upended what we thought of as the post-Cold War moment. But I also think it's upended what many of us thought about as the post-war liberal international order, what we talk about as free and open systems, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific or whether it's in Eurasia, are being challenged at this very moment on the ground. And so to see the way the Ukrainian people have responded to a much larger power, and to see the way that Russia and Putin's invasion of Ukraine is reshaping geopolitics. If you had told me a month ago, as someone who grew up in Hokkaido and literally was right next door to Russia, that Japan would have sanctioned Russia, and that all the economic opportunity and all the good relations between Russia and Japan that have been built up over Prime Minister Abe and President Putin's 27 encounters, I would have said that's probably not likely. But here we are. And what's interesting is Japan is very much following the West. I think the West as a geographic concept is no longer about West and East. It's about the free and open system and those that don't believe in that. So what China does in the coming days, weeks, and months will have a huge impact. And so I think the US-Japan context needs to be seen through that prism. There have already been major shifts. Germany has decided to start rearming in terms of Ukraine. It's decided to spend over 2% of its military budget, something that American presidents have been saying for a long time. It took a major shock to the international system, and unfortunately another war in Europe that takes us back 80 years for this moment. But here we are at this moment. And I think the big development in the last week has been, what is China doing? It symbolically says that they might support and they have some neutrality with Ukraine, but it seems very clear that there's a new emerging axis with authoritarian states, with Russia and China. And I think in that case, what we had already seen, which was a pivot and a shift towards Asia. This is clearly the Asian century, but this feels like a return to our past. It really is reminding us, those on the East Coast, how easy and how connected this country is to Europe, even as we try to pivot further to the west, out to our west, to Asia. And so I think in some ways, it's a very appropriate to think about this in the context of what the Trans-Pacific relationship, not just the US, Japan, but all the countries of this region are going to be doing. Because obviously Europe is on the front line, but what happens in Ukraine, if it stands, will have repercussions. So again, while the spotlight may be on Europe, what I want to focus on, and what I think Professor Nakabayashi and I want to talk to you about today, is how in this context, the political and economic situation of the US-Japan alliance has never been more important. You know, I think in many ways, when I think about the backdrop of the US-Japan relationship, it's clear that the Biden administration came in and the very first visitor to the White House was the Prime Minister of Japan. Now that Prime Minister Suga, is no longer there. So here's the discussion of how domestic politics directly affects our foreign policy. I would argue that at this point in time, as two democracies, our weakness is not our foreign policy. I think in some ways, US-Japan relations have never been stronger at the government level and with our foreign policies. But unfortunately, both countries are facing weakness from within. In the United States, obviously the events of January 6th in Washington have really given pause to the idea of being a United States. There are very clear divisions between the coast, between red states and blue states. It's affecting all of us. And when we think about how we're going to confront situations like this Russia invasion, if we're not united at home, it's very hard to have a united front abroad. I would argue that Putin has actually done something that we haven't seen in a long time. At the most recent State of the Union, President Biden got standing ovations from both Republicans and Democrats, sustained for the 5 minutes that he talked about Ukraine. That bipartisanship immediately evaporated when he switched to other topics, obviously. And of course, we have the midterms coming up that are going to be shaping a lot of what our future looks like. And then the presidential election in 2024 looms in this country. People around the world are taking notice. And I think particularly in Japan, there's been a bit of a whiplash going from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. The Trump administration was very centered on the president and individuals. Now I think under the Biden administration, there's a much clearer understanding of how to work with the administration. It's great to see Rahm Emanuel, after over 2.5 years of no ambassador in Japan, to be there very actively involved, kind of at the right moment as the beginning of the war with Russia began, the war in Ukraine began. But of course, on the Japanese side, it has not been easy either. You had the longest serving prime minister in terms of Abe, who stepped down before the Tokyo Olympics could actually go through. And you had his loyal deputy, Prime Minister Suga, step in, who did all the right things in terms of policy, but didn't seem to be able to communicate and to connect to the Japanese people. And so now we have Prime Minister Kishida, whose greatest test is still ahead of him. And I can't wait to hear on the ground from Tokyo what that means. But it's clear to me that the Kishida administration, the Biden administration, share all the same values. The idea that the Quad, in terms of the US, Japan, Australia, and India, are the leaders in Asia and will continue to drive. This most recent invasion of Ukraine has put a little bit of a wedge here, because it's clear that while the US and Japan and Australia are on one side of history, India has chosen to be neutral. And by being neutral, that puts it in a very different position. And when we think about the Quad Leaders Summit upcoming there in Tokyo in May, it's going to be interesting to see how they're able to bring together. You have at last count 141 countries that have condemned Russia's actions at the UN, and those 3 countries are part of it. India is not part of it. And so the question is, how do you have a system of governance if you can't even agree on some of the basics of what is aggression, what is not aggression? So I think in this moment, what my colleague and my former boss, Ian Bremer, talks about is the G0 world, where it's a really leaderless world. And it's not necessarily just about leaders at the top, but it's about all of us, the choices that we make as citizens of a democracy to make decisions about the importance of US-Japan. I think it's still very clear that the first largest and the third largest economy in the world have a huge impact in every aspect of our life, particularly on the economic side. But as China rises, as China begins to make its own choices, and we've seen a lot of that in the pandemic, and we saw it very clearly, the contrast contrast between the Tokyo Summer Olympics and the Beijing Winter Olympics. I think in many ways it was a real unfortunate situation that Japan could not welcome millions of visitors and see the omotenashi, the hospitality that Japan is known for. Whereas I think for China, it played right into its hands. That's exactly the type of Olympics they would like to have not have people in, not have people criticizing their human rights violations and everything else. So I think the point here to really think about is, as democracies, in many ways, our choices on the domestic front are very challenging. You've got an aging population in Japan. You've got a lot of the trend lines going in the wrong direction economically in both countries. And the question is, particularly from a Japanese point of view, if recession is around the corner, and in the United States, we have inflation and the Fed rates beginning to change, will we be able to compete, particularly in an environment where supply chains have been severely disrupted, gas prices are going through the roof? How are we going to be able to work together to mitigate those types of risks? How are we going to be able to maintain the international system that has undergirded the post-World War II environment? I would simply close with this. As a son of missionaries who grew up in Hokkaido, whose grandparents fought in World War II, I do not take for granted how close the US-Japan relationship is. I think for my children and for younger generations, it's easy to take it for granted. It's wonderful to see the popularity of Japanese culture. You can't go anywhere in New York without seeing Japanese food, without seeing anime, without seeing the soft power that Japan represents. But just as quickly, you could see that change if there were major differences and changes. I'm not saying that that's around the corner, but I do think it makes a difference for all of us as leaders in our own communities to commit and recommit to that connection. And so in that context, I think Hawaii has a unique role to play as it literally sits between the United States mainland and Japan, and thinking about the connections across the Pacific. Because as we hope to be turning a corner from the transatlantic century, the European century, to the Asian or the Trans-Pacific century, the United States is blessed to be able to look at both sides. And I think the war in Ukraine, in some ways, is a major distraction. And as long as this does not become a World War III scenario, where it's Russia using nuclear weapons, God forbid, or China deciding to step in a military way, there are so many other challenges that we could talk about in the region that we can think about, whether it's a Taiwan contingency, North Korean missiles. There are so many areas that we can talk about today. But I think there are some positive areas. I think whether it's the free and open Indo-Pacific I've already referenced, or whether it's cooperation on climate change, the US and Japan are critical allies, but it's not just our president and prime minister. They have to get the will and the support of leaders. They have to explain why this relationship matters and why sometimes US-Japan relations may not be as exciting as other places in the world. I used to always tell my friends, it's good not to be on the front page. It's good not to make the headlines sometimes. Japan is one of the few countries in the world that under-promises but over-delivers in international relations. That's not something in New York we're known for. We like to be brash and bold and talk about big things, but sometimes we've under-delivered as a nation. So the question is, as we move in to this new period, is there a way that we can work more closely with Japan? And are there places like Hawaii that traditionally have not been in the center of gravity when it comes to policymaking? There's a real East Coast establishment feel sometimes that I believe is beginning to change when you see the way that Japanese companies, the way that policymaking, the way that influence is seen across this country, where some of the leaders, particularly there in Hawaii, have continued to play a major role at reminding Americans that our future in many ways lies just as much and maybe more so to the West and to the Pacific as it does to the East and Europe, that we're being reminded about every day as we see Ukrainian flags hanging and we continue to support the brave people there. So with that, let me stop. I want to make sure we have a great conversation and kick it over to my colleague, Professor Nakabayashi over there in Tokyo. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walker. And before we go to Professor Nakabayashi, we are very glad that you are safe. We heard the news early this morning about a major earthquake off Fukuoka, I believe, and Tokyo was rattled, and we are so grateful that you are well. Thanks to Dr. Walker for setting the stage. I might add that because of the situation in Ukraine, as Dr. Walker mentioned, there seems to be more unity in the United States, politically and socially, than we have seen before. But today, when Russian sanctions were announced against American individuals, it was interesting to note that President Putin sanctioned only those who are of the Democratic Party and not of the Republican Party. And it shows that President Putin understands that there have been very deep fissures, very deep divisions in the United States, and he intends to pursue that. So just an observation. And now I'd like to turn it over to Professor Nakabayashi for the Japanese perspective.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Aloha from Tokyo. It was midnight when I experienced a long and shaky, very scary earthquake. But fortunately, Tokyo was okay. And I heard a bullet train in Tohoku was derailed. But so far, no life is lost because of the earthquake directly. So we'll see what kind of damage we got starting this morning. Actually, it is around 8 o'clock, 8:22 in Tokyo. And actually, I was supposed to appear on TBS, Tokyo Broadcasting System program around the noon. But because of the earthquake, my time is shifted a little bit to the later, I think, time slot. The subject of today's talk that I was supposed to give on TV was President from Ukraine spoke in front of American congressional members, and what kind of effect that would have. Interestingly, people in Japan are interested in what the Congress or the public opinion would affect the situation in Ukraine. President Zelensky is such a hero, and his appearance might have some kind of effect. And today's talk, as Dr. Walker mentioned, must really relate us to the Ukraine war and our democracy, and whether we could be united or not, domestically and internationally. Internationally means Western countries, including, of course, military alliance, NATO, or US-Japan military alliance, defense alliance. Those kind of things appear to be tightened because of the Putin's action in Ukraine. However, we don't know how long it can last. And as Barbara actually mentioned so well, that even Russia is looking at American domestic politics. And it is always domestic when we even need to talk about international affairs. Japanese domestic politics is also somewhat not as ideal, maybe, as to proceed with the new international order as China's rise and other huge conflicts that we are witnessing currently. Let me mention some domestic information regarding Japan so that we can discuss about things in depth. First of all, Prime Minister Kishida met online with President Biden on January the 21st for the first time. And what they discussed was, of course, a tight alliance between the United States and Japan, and how we can cooperate. Also, we Japanese people are so worried about North Korea's nuclear missile. And it was yesterday that Kim Jong-un tested another kind of satellite type of missile launching, although it appeared to have failed. However, failing is the mother of innovation, and testing is really important. Eventually, the country can be successful. So it was such a shaky world that we're experiencing now. And at the same time, as Dr. Walker mentioned, India is somewhat worrying because it didn't vote for the resolution against Russia and sustain their vote to remain neutral. But we hear that in the midst of energy sanction against Russia, Russia proposed to sell oil and other energy resource to India with huge discounted price. And they are even circumventing SWIFT sanction. And they are discussing to use, for example, renminbi, Chinese currency, and other currencies outside of American dollar. So India is such a huge country, and still we hope that India would be a great partner in our alliance type of community, which is called Quad, including the United States, Russia, of course, India and Japan. So it is really an important juncture of pulling those Asian countries into our community of democracy and freedom. Therefore, I really advocate to send messages to the people in India, because people's opinion somehow is pushing US Congress, President Biden, even Prime Minister Kishida to tighten our alliance with free nations. Let me go back to Japanese domestic issue. Japanese defense budget remains around 1%, which is significantly lower than other major economies. Prime Minister Kishida is trying to raise it. However, Japanese budget deficit is the worst among any developed economies. Therefore, of course, because of the COVID-19 and other things and aging society that Japan is experiencing, it is important for Prime Minister Kishida to find a way to increase the defense budget. He has a very, actually, well, I shouldn't say innovative, but he is hoping to change Japanese national defense posture by concluding major reports about Japanese defense posture by the end of this year. He's not doing it right now during this ordinary diet session, because the election is approaching soon, probably in July. The ordinary session ends in June. Therefore, the election might be called in July, which is a very important election for Prime Minister Kishida and LDP. Let me explain that for a little bit. First, 2022 is the year of the tiger, and Prime Minister Kishida wants to, I think, continue to be a prime minister. In order to do that, as I mentioned, July upper house election is really important. If we look back the past, former Prime Minister Abe lost his election for the upper house in 2007. And he started to suffer all sorts of quagmire at the diet. And he resigned after 1 year of his prime ministership. In order to avoid that kind of things, Prime Minister Kishida needs to do well in the upper house for the upper house election in July. in order to achieve his goals during the this ordinary session, he has to be careful because he does not want to lose that election in July. In order to be successful and cautious, he has to control somehow the ruling coalition very well. Of course, pay attention to Komeito when they proposed huge sort of pork barrel to distribute checks to individuals. LDP didn't promise that during the general election last year. However, Prime Minister Kishida somehow yielded his position and took Komeito's ideas and did some pork barrel type of budgeting. And the session is going to be for 50-day session or so, 150 day or so. And he is planning lots of bills to propose. However, he will be very cautious. That's the reason that his major ideas of revising the national security policies and other things will come up later after the election. Those big ideas will be including, for example, not only the defense posture reports that he is renewing, but also his economic security legislation, which is greatly connected to China's rise and Russia's atrocity currently going on. And that bill is getting currently put together. And so far, they say that supply chains will be somehow protected and reconsidered, and restricting access to patent information related to national security. Of course, that is Japan's and the United States and allies. And beefing up cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is becoming a huge area of interest. Even looking at the Russian tactics, there is no question about cybersecurity is so important. Also actively supporting the development of cutting-edge technologies at companies and universities. And we haven't really put these kind of things together yet, but the administration is currently studying these pretty intensively. And looking at domestic politics, Mr. Kishida's popularity is pretty good. This month, NHK took a poll, even including all sorts of issues that Prime Minister is conducting. Overall, his support rate is 53%. And those who are not supporting is 25%. So doing pretty well, even comparing with President Biden, because he is handling things so carefully. His real ultimate goal is to win the election this year for the upper house. And if he wins, he can avoid any kind of national elections until year 2025. So he can gain his freedom of 3 years if he doesn't call for general election, which is called snap election, by dissolving the diet. So he can enjoy 3 years of his administration, maybe, and he can really implement what he wants to do after that, which is after summer this year. So we'll see whether he would do well or not. So he is being so cautious, and his support rate is currently 53%. But we never know. In 2007, when Prime Minister then Abe lost the upper house election in summer, his support rate was great. But during the Golden Week holiday season, there were a series of scandals. Therefore, Prime Minister Kishida would never know what kind of difficulties he would face right in front of the upper house election. So we have to be very cautious too, and he has to be very cautious. And because he was so cautious, he closed the border for COVID-19 prevention, and hundreds of thousands of people couldn't enter Japan from overseas and so on. But people actually supported that kind of things. That's the reason that he really virtually, closed the border, which was very unpopular overseas. And I wouldn't support that, but the people were kind of supporting it. Well, also for Russian issues, Kishida actually implemented swift restriction against Russia, and yesterday he said he would revoke most favorite trade partner of Russia from Japanese trade partners, and he also, of course, sanctions lots of leaders over there in Russia. And Russia actually named Japan as unfriendly nation. And yesterday, Russian battleships actually went through this area, the sea area between Hokkaido and Honshu, which is called Tsugaru Kaikyo. So there are some threats that the Russian military is showing against Japan. But of course, Japan should be no choice, but it should be with free and democratic nations as part of the allies. And Japanese people take the poll taken this week or last week, somewhere around there in March, says that Prime Minister Kishida's policy toward Russia is supported. 6% supported strongly, 52% supported somewhat strongly, and somewhat 27% said they would not somewhat appreciate Prime Minister Kishida's policy against Russia.
Well, thank you.
Well, maybe because of the economic impact.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay,
Professor.
yes, thank you so much. And those are the current Japanese sentiment. Thank you, and I look forward to exchange opinions with Dr. Joshua.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Nakabayashi. In fact, the poll numbers for the Prime Minister and the President seem to be rather positive right now, but you never know in any kind of political atmosphere because both the United States and Japan are facing elections this year, so we will see. But if I could just open up the floor for questions. If you have any questions here for the live audience, please indicate by raising your hand and we'll send a mic to you. If you are online, please send your questions via chat. Reina, are there any questions that have come in? No? Not yet. Okay, so we have a question from Steve Sombrero. So Steve, please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi,
Steve.
Thank you very much for a very, very fascinating presentation. I have a question regarding heiwa boke. It's a Japanese term, and the literal translation is peace idiots. And Japan has been living so many years since World War II under a very peaceful situation, peaceful society, peaceful world. And the word heiwa boke comes up once in a while, saying that the people of Japan have become so complacent and disconnected from the rest of the world. If you go to an izakaya, for instance, and you ask the young people what's going on in their minds, global topics never really come up. Is what's going on in Ukraine the stimulus or the trigger to wake up the Japanese from the heiwa boke? are people more interested in global issues?
Professor Nakabayashi, you're in Tokyo. Do you want to start? And I have a few thoughts as
Yes.
well.
Sure, yes. I think first, media is changing, and they're reporting lots of scenes from Ukraine, and people started to realize that we cannot just say peace to realize peace. I think it is a huge change. However, at the same time, people's sentiment cannot be changed that quickly. Maybe that is the reason that somewhat 27 or 30% or so people would not support Prime Minister Kishida's policy. Or maybe people may think that we should go strongly against Russia than now. But in any event, we are waking up. However, and I think politicians are waking up and trying to proceed new policies or laws pretty in depth. But people's sentiment needs to change, I think even more, to raise, for example, Japanese budget for defense. It is such a huge hurdle to raise that budget.
Dr. Walker?
I mean, I'll pick up right where you left off. And I think you're raising a really good point, Steve, which is that I've been really surprised at how Ukraine has actually generated a lot of interest. I mean, it's one of the few times in my lifetime I've been getting text messages from everyone, from my father-in-law to people I haven't heard to from a long time, because they know I follow these things. And the same with my friends in Japan, who, as you pointed out, tend to be not as interested, particularly younger generation. I think, but that's true in America too, by the way, right? Like, we don't vote on foreign policy, and I think this is one of the key moments that we're all focusing. And I think the question is, in Japan, because of the experiences of World War II, there's still a hangover of that, and the pacifist constitution and the kind of general feeling that, well, war is a bad thing, which I think we can all agree on, but at a certain point in a dangerous world in which you have certain responsibilities, and as a nation that needs to defend the rule of law and free and open systems, what does that mean for Japan? And there's been incremental change over time, but this is actually a place where I think the concept of gaiatsu, or outside in pressure, is important. Japanese politicians on their own saying, we're going to stand up and we're going to make our military stronger, the first thing that's going to happen is the Chinese and Koreans are going to complain about it and say, don't forget about the past. Whereas if the United States and others say, this is necessary, and Japan needs to be capable to send, and you know, in Ukraine, by the way, they are sending you know, helmets and defensive capabilities, which I never would have thought. Japan's never done this before. And so looking at the type of assistance they're doing, at least the government is there. Whether the population, and particularly the younger generation and the, you know, the peaceniks are there yet, we got a long way to go. But if this war continues, I think you're going to see an outcry. And the question is, how can you know, people be able to explain this in a way that Japanese population can build it into their identity, as opposed to saying, well, we just don't do war anymore as a country. I mean, I think in concept that's great, but we all understand the world that we live in, and there's not really an international system unless you're able to stop aggression and you're able to stop bullies in different neighborhoods.
Thank you very much. I'd like to widen this topic a little bit. Dr. Walker, you did mention China. China is a strong ally of Russia and has not condemned the Russian attack, and as a matter of fact, seems to be encouraging Russia as far as hints of promise of economic relief. What I'd like to do is see how that would affect China's performance or behavior in the Pacific regarding the Senkaku Islands, regarding Taiwan. How do you and how do the Japanese see China's role shifting as a result of what China is saying about the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
I'll start and then hand it over to Professor Nakabayashi, because I saw the question that you just referenced about the impact of Taiwan. Look, this is a typical DC type of thing, which is to say, okay, the real game is about US-China competition. The real trigger point that could really cause major conflict here is Taiwan. So therefore, what lessons can we learn from Ukraine? I think you're right, Barbara, to open the aperture here a little bit and to say, okay, this didn't happen in a vacuum. You know, President Putin was there for the opening of the Beijing Olympics. He clearly communicated to Xi Jinping his plans, right? And so the fact that they waited until right after the Olympics and they decided to invade, and that Chinese propaganda outlets have been parroting the Russian line is very telling. There's really no ability inside of China to combat that narrative. This has major implications because when you're talking about a country like China that has such a important role in the world, if it's choosing to throw its lot in with Russia, and some of the information I've gotten is that rather than kind of sanctioning and pulling out, they're trying to get a good deal. Because when you look at the energy infrastructure that the West is trying to turn away from and wean itself off of Russian oil, China is stepping right into the mix and is getting a deal with its Chinese banks. If you're a Chinese banker right now, you're being encouraged to go in because they can't fathom a world in which Russia, with its military might and nuclear power, is not going to be a major player. They can't imagine they're going to lose. But I think that what's interesting is, in terms of what China is learning throughout this, number one, I think they are learning certain red lines. Now, there's a really big difference between a Eurasian country and a landmass with military intervention in terms of just having troops come over. And I think what Russia is showing is you should never try that. Even Russian military is being bogged down every step of the way. That would never happen in Taiwan. Taiwan will be an amphibious missile defense, system where it's going to be a very quick and dirty scenario. Very different than Ukraine, which is a large landmass, has large population. Taiwan is very small. If there's a conflict, it's going to be ugly very quickly. So you don't want to get to that. There's no de-escalation strategy there. So I think American policymakers are thinking a lot about this, and they're thinking about how to strengthen Taiwan's own capabilities. One thing we're learning from Ukraine is you should be investing before the problem, because once it's in a war, it's very hard to get military aircraft, for example, to Ukraine, because that then immediately triggers a Russian response. I think in Taiwan, I think Japanese policymakers are watching very carefully, and I'd be interested in Professor Nakabayashi's thinking on this, but I'm hearing lots of debate inside of Japan. The fact that former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is now talking about nuclear deterrence, having American nuclear capabilities, which we all know are around Japan, but not overtly in Japan, is a huge game changer. And I think the other piece is Japanese posture towards Taiwan. They've always had close relations, but when I listen to Prime Minister Abe's brother, who's the defense minister, strongly say that Taiwan is a part of our security, that's a very different Japan than I'm used to hearing, particularly from those politicians. So there is something going on here. I think that in some ways this is encouraging from an American point of view, because it means that Japan is going to have to really pick sides. You can't have economic good relations with China, good relations with security, and kind of pass the buck, so to speak. Japan has to be on side with the United States when it comes to dealing with China's aggression, not just in Taiwan, but in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, all the other places we've seen. But Professor Nakabayashi, please, from a Tokyo perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, as Dr. Walker mentioned, Taiwan is something that we can be connected when we talk about China and Russia, those aggressions. But I think Taiwan is not just isolated Taiwan. We are interested in Taiwan because Japan itself has a huge conflict with China with regard to Senkaku Islands. And Taiwan is so close from Senkaku Islands. That's why Defense Minister Kishida even mentioned Taiwan is our affair, because once Taiwan is attacked, Yonajima and other small islands away from Honshu, Tokyo area, could be directly affected. And if Taiwan is taken, next it's going to be Senkaku Islands. And then next would be Okinawa. Therefore, our freedom and democracy will be threatened. That's the logic that Japanese people could connect themselves to the affairs of Taiwan. Of course, Taiwan is such a friendly area or nation. Well, it is not a nation, but independent government. And we have so much attachment to Taiwanese people. However, I think the direct reason is Japanese territories could be threatened. At the same time, it is interesting that Japan is trying to change, for example, to admit refugees from Ukraine, and those are somewhat related to change Japanese people's mind about war and refugees and what Japan can do. And not only sending lots of materials as much as we could, although it is so far away to Ukraine, those are always reminding us about Chinese possible aggression against Taiwan. And our economy is also threatened. Sanctions against Russia is impacting Japan so much. And inflation here is really hitting in reality. However, if this is about China, Japanese economy is going to be devastated so much, too much. Therefore, preventing it is so important. And we learned that showing our weakness is not good to prevent any kind of aggressions, looking at Ukraine's case. Therefore, I think the Japanese government and lots of people are supporting these days to protect Japan before it is sucked into any kind of conflicts. Therefore, as I mentioned, defense budget is so important, and innovation is important. Economic security is also important, not only with old-style military buildup, but also cyberspace and even the space itself, a satellite type of thing. And those are the things that Japanese government is looking into.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Reina, we do have a question online.
Yes, we do. So, Dr. Walker, Professor Nakabayashi, the question is, what are the current policies of Ukraine refugees entering Japan? And also about the USA policies to accept Ukrainian refugees.
So this is the refugee question. I believe, Professor Nakabayashi, you mentioned something about Japan is open and willing now, which is quite unusual.
That's right. Well, but still the number is extremely low. Japan is not accepting many refugees in general. And for this war case, the government said that refugees are not counted within the limit of foreigners to be able to come into Japan. Currently, Japanese limit is 7,000 foreigners to come to Japan, and actually 5,000, and the Prime Minister is raising it to 7,000. And there's even a national poll taken for that. It is somewhat supported, but lots of people are not really supporting it because they wanted to be cautious about COVID-19. However, for the refugees from Ukraine, they are not included into whatsoever the limit of this kind of COVID-19 restriction. But still, lately they admitted only 8 people. I thought that was 80,000 people, but 8 people. So it was almost nothing.
Well,
And I think also Tokyo governor and other local leaders announced that they will open up their residence and all sorts of facilities for the refugees coming from Ukraine. But the number is not that impressive yet. Therefore, I think Japanese people must work on it very hard.
Well, thank you very much. You know, 8 people, baby steps, always the way to go. Dr. Walker, as far as the U.S. accepting refugees, there's been quite a bit of talk recently in Washington. Can you bring us up to date?
Yeah, I mean, it's much more than 8. That's the good news in the American case. And you know, here in New York, we have the largest Ukrainian American population. I know that they're mobilizing. I was talking to the consul general recently, and actually some of the work here, the Japanese consulate is working closely with the Ukrainian consulate. The Japanese American population is trying to mobilize, because I think that everyone sees that what's happening there could very easily happen more broadly. But the more interesting thing, rather than the number of people, because I think that, you know, to Nakabayashi-san's point, what these people need right now is immediate assistance. And so I was talking to my friend who's the Japanese ambassador in Poland recently, and he was sharing kind of what it was like on the border. And you just saw the vice president and the secretary of state, and you actually just saw the president of Poland go into Ukraine. So I think that really what we're looking at is a scenario in which you're going to have at least 1/4 of Ukraine, a country of 40 million people, about 10 million or so refugees, flowing out because it's easier to get out of the land bridges. And then those that have means will probably start coming at some point. But this is a very different scenario than what we saw with Afghanistan. Remember, in Afghanistan, you had a sudden collapse. And because America had been in Afghanistan for so long, there was a certain moral responsibility that America alone could take these people. I think in this case, we're going to lean much heavier on Ukraine's European neighbors here, and particularly Poland, Hungary, Slovenia, those countries that have basically said they would take it in. That's where I think U.S. aid and American assistance will be most necessary. Those that are coming, of course, have family members, and Ukrainian Americans are really focused. Here in New York City, the mayor has made it very clear that it's open. And actually, our international affairs commissioner happens to be Ukrainian American. So it's a daily issue here in New York. And I'm sure every state, every city around this country, every society is thinking about what they can do. But it does feel a little bit different in the sense that the best aid is probably in the neighborhood. And we still don't know what's going to happen. If Ukraine falls and there's a government in exile, that's a very different scenario than finding some type of ceasefire that then would allow Ukraine to rebuild and maybe have contested cold conflict areas that, like we have in the eastern part of Ukraine, that triggered this entire conflict back in 2014. And it's easy to forget that this conflict has been ongoing for close to 10 years. It wasn't just the last month. This is when President Putin decided to escalate and try to, you know, change the ground by military force, which clearly has not been working out very well for him. But ultimately, we're going to see how this plays out.
Yes, and then next week, President Biden will be traveling to meet with the heads of the European allies, and we will see what happens. But I must say, in the past 3 weeks, all of us have seen video coming out of Ukraine, and it has been really disheartening to see the inhumanity that prevails in Europe. And many of us feel that it wasn't necessary, but that's what happens when the political situation becomes too extreme. So it's very, very unfortunate. We do thank Dr. Walker and Professor Nakabayashi for this very engaging discussion. And now I'll turn it over back to Reina.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you for being our moderator for today, too. Barbara always tells me, can you find someone else? Because I keep calling on her to moderate our programs, but she's extraordinary. So please give Barbara a hand. And thank you, Dr. Walker and Professor Nakabayashi, for being our guest speakers today. We, really value hearing your opinions on this topic. I'm sure everyone has their opinions as well, but it's always great to be able to share. And, we hope that you enjoyed it, although you're far away from us. Next time, you can be here with us in person in Honolulu. So thank you so much for being our guest speakers. And I do want to thank our live audience for coming today and joining us, and also our virtual audience for joining us today and providing questions, and really it's just great to be able to be together again, and we hope this is a good sign of things to come, that JASH can go back to our live events again and bring more of this kind of programming to you all. And so I hope that for those of you who aren't members of JASH, here in the live audience or in the virtual audience. If you like this program and you're interested in things like this and other things, business networking, military relations, JASH does a number of different programming. So please become a member of JASH. You can do that by going to our website, www.jashawaii.org. If you are a member, thank you very much for your support. I see many members here today, and I saw many in the virtual audience too. We really thank you for your support, particularly during these last couple of tough years, when we really couldn't see you in person and be able to show you and bring to you this kind of programming. So we really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you so much. Domo arigatou gozaimasu. And domo arigatou gozaimasu, Dr. Walker, Professor Nakabayashi, and Barbara. Please have a good rest of your day, rest of your evening, and stay safe, Professor Nakabayashi. Please stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yasumi Asai from New York. Thank you. Otsukare-sama.
Bye-bye from Tokyo.